Welcome back to another session, and in this session we are going to discuss about cross pollination. As I have already told you that cross pollination is transfer of pollen from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, which can be present on the same plant or it can be present on any other flower present on a different plant, but they have to be of the same species. Now, this one you can see that on the left hand side there is a bee which is visiting a flower, and it is probably visiting the flower for the pollen grains, which can be a source of food for the bee. So, the bee will collect the bee can also be extracting nectar, and in the process the pollen grains get deposited onto the body parts of this bee. And now when this bee visits another flower for still more food, then it can, just a matter of chance, transfer these pollen onto the stigma, and this leads to pollination. So, whenever there is pollination with the involvement of any agency, it is called as cross pollination. We have already talked about self pollination in the last class, and we have learnt that self pollination is transfer of pollen from anther to stigma of the same or another flower of the same plant. So, when we talk about cross pollination, this is the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma of different flower of another plant, but of the same species. Now, we have just discussed that for cross pollination external agent is required. For self pollination no external agent is required. In self pollination, anther and stigma mature at the same time. In cross pollination, it is not necessary for the anther and the stigma to mature at the same time. In self pollination, very less number of pollen grains are produced, as the pollination is targeted. Targeted means it is happening within the same flower. Whereas in cross pollination, because it is not decided as to how much distance the pollen has to travel to reach the right type of stigma, so the flower invests in producing huge quantities of pollen, because there is no guarantee of pollination. Self-pollination can occur in both cleistogamous as well as chasmogamous flowers. On the contrary, cross-pollination can never occur in cleistogamous flowers. Flowers have to open, and then only pollination can take place. Self-pollination leads to inbreeding depression and formation of homozygous offsprings. Cross pollination, on the other hand, leads to formation of heterozygous offsprings which exhibit hybrid vigor. Like I had talked to you about the different mechanisms which promote self-pollination, we also have certain mechanisms which favor or promote cross-pollination, and these are diacy, dichogamy, hercogamy, heterostyly, and self-incompatibility. So, I will be taking up each of these processes or phenomenon individually. Diacy or dicliny. Now, this is one phenomenon which ensures that pollination can only happen with the intervention of some agency, because the plant produces flowers of only one type of sex, or we can say that there are unisexual flowers which are produced. So, if there are flowers of only one sex, then there can be no pollination and fertilization happening in that flower. Individual flowers are either male, which we call as staminate flowers, or female, which are referred to as the pistillate flowers. These impose crossing as the only means of pollination, because a male plant of course is producing anthers. So, anthers, there is presence of pollen grains, but then how these pollen grains will reach the stigma which is present in another flower. So, there is requirement of cross pollination and an agency for the transfer of pollen to the stigma. Then is dichogamy. Dichogamy is another phenomenon which favors cross pollination. The anther and a stigma of the flower, they mature at different times. In this particular picture you can see creativa flowers. The leftmost flower, you can see that there are anthers which are mature and ready to dehisce. In the second picture, the anthers have dehisced. In third one, there is nothing left on the anther filament, yet the stigma has just come to maturity. So, what happens here is the anther and stigma of a flower, they mature at different times. In creativa, the anthers dehisce much before the stigma attains maturity. This phenomenon is called as protandry. Protandry is when the anther matures before the stigma. If the stigma matures first, then it is protogyny. So, in creativa, there is a persistence of protandry. Okay. In another flower, that is Aristolochia, and even in magnolia, stigma becomes receptive much before the anthers dehisce. In this one, this is a picture of a magnolia flower. There is a protogynous flower of magnolia which you can see. The arrow is pointing to the expanded stigmas. Down below are the stamens which are not yet mature or they have not yet dehisced. Under such circumstances, autogamy cannot occur and cross pollination is the only alternative. Third phenomenon is hercogamy. Cross pollination is favored by spatial separation of male and female organs in a flower. Now, spatial separation means that they occupy different places in a flower. The position of anther and stigma here, it becomes a barrier to self-pollination. In Caryophyllaceae, the stigma projects much above the anthers. Now, when the stigma is much above the anthers, whenever the anther dehisces, it is difficult for the pollen to reach up to the stigma because the stigma is at a higher level. So, it prevents the pollen from the same flower to land on the stigma. Another example is Gloriosa, where the anthers dehisce from a distance from the stigma. Here you can see this is a Gloriosa flower. The stigma is towards the center, whereas the anthers are placed laterally and they are moving outwardly from the flower. So, you see that the anthers here, they are whenever they will dehisce outwardly. So, the pollen will spread in different directions and it becomes difficult for the pollen to come back to the stigma. So, this particular picture you can see a flower of Gloriosa superba with stigma being spatially separated from the anthers, and the whole phenomenon is hercogamy. Yet another phenomenon which favors cross pollination is heterostyly. Now, this is a type of hercogamy in which plants, they exhibit polymorphic styles. Polymorphic styles means there can be more than one type of styles which are present in a flower. Two or more forms of flower are seen, and these different forms of flower, they differ in heights at which the stamens and the style are positioned. Based on the number of type of flowers, heterostyly is of two types, distyly and tristyly. Differences in the morphology of flowers which are borne by a species, they prevent self-pollination. In distyler species, as the name suggests, distyly means there are two types of flowers which are present, pin and the thrum. And when we talk about tristyler species, three types of flowers are present, each with a different styler length. Now, when there are when there is dimorphic flowers, there are two morphologies which are present. One is the pin morph and other is the thrum morph. In pin morph, the flowers possess a long style and short stamens. In thrum morph, the flowers possess a short style and long stamens. The reciprocal arrangement of sex organs, it increases the chances of pollination between the two morphs rather than within the same flower. For instance, we will be talking about Primula vulgaris here, which is an insect pollinated species. Now, when an insect visits a thrum morph, it is likely to get pollen deposited on its body in such a position that facilitates pollination when this insect later visits a pin morph. So, this is a distylous condition where there are two types of styles which are present. On the left hand side is the pin morph. Now, this pin morph, actually this term has come from the common pin. You would have seen a common pin which is used for tagging papers, you know, we can put them together using a common pin. So, common pin is made of steel and it has a small circular head and a long tail. Now, here since this here there is a long style and there is a short stamen which is present, the morphology is referred to as the pin morph. The second morphology, the thrum morphology, is where the style is short and the stigmas are long. Now, you can see that the stigmas in thrum morph, they correspond to the styler length which is seen in a pin morph. So, the pollen from the thrum morph, they are deposited on the stigma which is present in a pin morph. Vice versa, the pollen from pin morph, they are transferred to the stigma which is present in the thrum morph. This is actual picture of a flower which shows distyly in primula. So, you can see the pin morph where the anthers are down below and the stigma, the style is much above, and the reciprocal arrangement is seen in case of the thrum morph which is present on the right hand side. Then comes tristyly. Tristyly is a more complex condition where flowers exhibit three different lengths of styles as well as stamens. Now, these are long styled morphologies, midway style morphology and a short style morphology. It is estimated that heterostyly is prevalent in at least 28 angiosperm families and it is widely associated with animal pollination. Now, this is tristyly which you see here. So, like I mentioned that there are three different styler lengths which are present. The first one is the long style, the second is the mid style and then there is a small style. Now, another important or interesting feature which you see here is that of course, there is variation in the length of the style. The anthers are present in two whorls, right. The stamens are in two whorls and these two whorls occupy different levels. So, now we have three different lengths in each flower. At one length there is the style and at the other two lengths are the two whorls of the anthers which are present. So, the anther of maybe with the length 1 can pollinate the other pistil which is at the corresponding length. Now this is oxalis. You can see that flowers, 3 different flowers of 3 different morphologies are present here. There are red arrows which indicate the length of the style. The left one has a short style which is down below, and above that there are 2 whorls of the stamens, and in the mid-length style the 2 whorls of the stamens are one below the style and one above the style. In the third one, which is the long style condition, the style occupies the stigma with the elongation of the style occupies the topmost position, and the lower 2 lengths or the lower 2 levels are occupied by 2 whorls of anthers, right. And the last phenomenon which features or which favors cross pollination is self incompatibility. Self incompatibility means the self pollen is not compatible or the self pollen is rejected. Self pollinations, they do not result in fertilization. Either it could be because of inability of pollen to germinate on self stigma, or sometimes the pollen tube gets inhibited during the while it is passing through the style. The gametes which are derived from the same parent, they are unable to fertilize the same genotype. Hence, pollen from genetically distant conspecific plants are required to accomplish pollination and fertilization, as self-pollinations fail in these cases. Now, we have already talked about the modes of pollination which occur in different angiosperm families. Pollination, like I have already explained, it can be biotic or abiotic when it is dependent on any agencies. Otherwise, self-pollination requires no external agency. Now, depending on the agency, if there is an abiotic agency, then the pollination can be aided by either wind or water. Biotic agencies can be many. These can be insects, and in insects too we have butterflies, and we have moths, and we have bees and beetles, so on and so forth. Then there can be birds and bats. These are all biotic agents of pollination. Now, what is very interesting is that the data of about 13,500 genera which is available in angiosperms, 12,000 are pollinated by insects, 874 pollinated by wind or water, 500 pollinated by birds, and 250 pollinated by bats. So, when we talk about 13,500, it is just about 874 which are pollinated by wind or water. Rest all are pollinated by biotic agencies. Now, each flower is adapted, whichever is pollinated by some insect or bird or bat, they have variously adapted themselves in terms of shape, size, structure, color and odor, and this complements the agent which is involved in pollination. The correlation between the floral traits of plants and the corresponding agent, this is often referred to as pollination syndrome. The suits of floral traits, they play a crucial role in dispersal of pollen of plant species, especially in ones reproducing strictly by means of cross pollination, and very rarely it can even happen in cases of self pollination. So, like I have already given you one example, that a flower, wherever it is tubular, probably it gets pollinated by a bird which has a long beak, and it can access the base of the flower using the long beak, and it is easy for the bird to put in its beak into the tubular shape. or those flowers which are pollinated by bats, they may be leathery in texture, they may be heavier so that they can take the weight of the bat. So, there are different adaptations which are occurring both in flowers as well as their pollinators, and this is what is called as the pollination syndrome. Now, talking about the different types of pollinations which occur in angiosperms, first and the foremost we will be talking about pollination by wind, and this is called as anemophily. That is, the pollen grains are transported by air currents, and this phenomenon is exhibited in 10% of angiosperms. Now, wind pollination is favored in a very dry environment. Now, this dry environment means that the level of humidity and even of precipitation has to be very low. This will facilitate anther dehiscence and pollen dispersal, because if it is not dry, if the atmosphere is more humid, then the pollen are difficult to disperse. They can't travel long distances. Species which typically inhabit open terrains, so that there is free flow of wind occurring in dense populations, increase the probability of reaching receptive stigmatic surfaces. Now, there are certain characteristics of anemophily or of wind pollination, that flowers are typically inconspicuous, simple, green or dull in color with a very reduced perianth. Why is this possible? This is because these flowers are not going to attract any pollinators, so they do not really have to invest in a bright color, and also they do not have a big perianth, so that some pollinator has to get attracted to the perianth. Stamens are exerted, that is, mostly they are sticking out of the flower, which enables the pollen grains to disperse even if the wind velocity is very, very low. Stigmas are feathery. Now, these feathery stigmas is again an adaptation for wind pollination, because the feathery stigmas they are now increasing the surface area by being feathery. When the surface area increases, that means the probability of pollen landing on the stigma, they are manifold. Pollen here are light, dry and generally small in size. Now, this is possible because there is a quick dispersal which is required for these pollen grains. If the pollen are not light, if they are not dry, they are sticky, then they will not travel larger distances. They will keep sticking on to nearby places, to flowers or whatever comes their way. Now, many of the world's most important crop plants like wheat, rice, corn, barley, these are pollinated by winds. This particular picture which you see here, this is a spike of Carex pendula which shows very reduced floral adaptations. Now, you can see that whenever there is a dehiscence of anther, you can see there is a cloud of pollen which is present. So, the pollen are dispersed and you do not see much vegetation near around, so that there is free mobility of pollen in open areas. Pollen are produced in huge quantities in anemophilous species. These are generally unornamented and they do not contain pollen kit. Now, this obliterates the possibility of clumping of pollen, because there are no carbohydrates and lipids which are present on the surface of these pollen. Since there is no agent of pollination involved, the pollen are of very low nutritional content, because they may not be able to serve as a nutrient for any biological agency, especially those involved in pollination, because pollination is being carried out by wind. Plants, they do not invest in the production of nectar, color or scent for pollinators, because such plants, they do not require any pollinators. The number of ovules per ovary is much reduced. The position of flowers is instrumental. The position of flowers is such that they can very easily capture the airborne pollen. Inflorescences are not covered by foliage, and plants occur in a leafless canopy, or if it is not leafless, the inflorescence is little outside or towards the periphery of the plant, so that there is a free mobility of pollen grains, and this is seen in mulberry, shetut. Okay. Inflorescences are highly condensed and exposed. Flowers are arranged in long pendant catkins. They can be long inflorescences which dangle from the branches, so that the pollen are easily shaken loose by the wind. Plant height or even the positioning of male and female reproductive organs plays an important role in pollen dispersal. Taller plants disperse pollen better. But yes, the ability of taller plants to disperse pollen is better, but the shorter plants are better in collecting or catching the pollen grains. In the next class, we will continue with anemophily and other types of pollination, and for today we will finish our class here only. Maybe we will start with all the agencies of pollination again in the next class. Thank you very much.